crisisIbility, Episode 3. As a society, we've hit a major roadblock. The question is, how are we going to navigate to overcome the crises that stand before us? 4 of us have come together to explore this. This includes myself, Alan Fine, founder and CEO of Elluette GBC, Devry Boughner Vorwerk, founder and CEO of Devry BV Sustainable Strategies, Steve Young, Global Executive Director of the Cow Roundtable for Moral Capitalism, and Michael Wright, founder and CEO of Intercepting Horizons. Welcome to crisisIbility, where we seek conversations to transcend crises with possibilities. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome, Johanna. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
And welcome to crisisIbility, where we're going to talk about crisis and possibilities in relationship to food this morning. We're all very impressed, Johanna, by your knowledge of food as a policy vehicle. Wondering if you could share with us your perspective on food in conjunction with the current coronavirus situation here in the United States.
Well, thank you. And that's a really good and important question. I think we have the assumption that we have an unending supply of food. But one of the things we don't realize is that food and conflict have always been closely associated, and that in the 21st century, food insecurity has been a real driver of conflict. So that lesson, which of course has not happened in the United States, has happened in other parts of the world when there have been financial setbacks. Obviously, we have a big, strong food system. A quarter of our workforce is involved in food, and that has economic consequences, which I'm sure you're more aware of, Alan, than I am. But the point is that we must still consider the impact of the coronavirus's slowdown of the economy on our continuous supply of food. Now, the United States is lucky. We're not going to run out of food anytime soon. But if you went to the grocery store last week or even over the weekend to stock up, you would think that a war was coming on. So perhaps the president was right when he said we're at war now. But in fact, we need to be cognizant of our supply, because as this virus spreads and affects people from the growers to the distributors, we are going to see diminutions in supply. Not like we see in West Africa or Southeast Asia, but yes, we are going to see challenges. And that is one of the reasons I get concerned about people not understanding the implications of the nexus of food and conflict.
Devry, maybe you could add to this.
Well, thank you. And I'm so pleased, Johanna, to have you and someone of your caliber and background on crisisIbility. And as we've discussed, first, you're our first guest, which is...
I'm honored, very honored.
Because the way that Johanna and I met was through food, through our work in the social gastronomy movement, which is a very localized movement around how we address issues at the community level and use food as a power for social change. And at the same time, it's a global movement. And so I'm thrilled to be here with you, Johanna. One thing I would like to add for our viewers to what you're saying is that, you know, for us who have been in the food industry, we know that we have an incredibly robust supply chain and the safest food supply in the world. And but for our viewers, one thing that they are experiencing is they're seeing these shortages in the grocery stores, and they're not necessarily able to translate that into the reality, which is our food supply. And I've heard a lot of retailers come out overnight, just overnight, and say, look, we've got enough food if consumers would start purchasing responsibly. And I'm wondering if we can talk about that a bit, Johanna, and for Mike and Alan and Steve to chime in. What does that mean to purchase responsibly? Because I'm going to tell you, for someone who's been in the industry, even last night I looked at my husband and said, well, should we be buying more? And when I went online with my traditional way to purchase right now, which is to purchase through Shipt, the service, everything was gone. And everything was being substituted, and the delivery was put out till Sunday, when usually it comes in an hour. So there's clearly a disconnect between our food reality, where we still have a robust food system at the moment, and what consumers are experiencing and then reacting to. So I wonder if we can talk about the possibility element in all of this.
I'm going to say one thing, but I'd love to hear from people in the economic field as well. I think one thing that is driving this is a lack of understanding about the food chain in the United States. But the second has to do with the economic impact, of which my expertise is less, that people now have a paycheck. They're still getting paid. Even in the restaurant industry, I noticed many of my colleagues are saying, we will pay you through the end of the month. So part of the buying or the cleaning out of shelves may reflect the fact that we may not get a next paycheck. And
Right.
that the issue of safety nets, which I'd be interested in hearing some of your colleagues on this podcast talk about, because that's exactly what this government wants to do, even though they say this is a socialist aspect of it. Safety nets are critical to any democratic system if we're going to have safety.
Steve, maybe you could speak to the moral implications of what we're experiencing here.
Well, I could, but Johanna, your reference to food and conflict brought to mind actually the sort of subconscious background of what I've been thinking about, which is creativity at the level of the family and the individual. But so I served in Vietnam. My wife is Vietnamese, and I remember both Hoa to this day has sort of different buying habits from the ordinary American. I think the ordinary American is very picky. We think we want something, we go to the store, it's always there. You want Haagen-Dazs ice cream, you got a choice of 15 varieties or something. Well, anyway, I remember in Saigon, my mother-in-law, she would go to the market, and she had, before the communists took over North Vietnam, they were like one of the wealthiest families in the North. So now she's dealing with a lot of really post-traumatic stress disorders after they fled South. She'd go to the market and it would have X, but not Y. So she would have to buy X. I mean, she might have wanted to do something with beef, but there was no beef that day, but there was a chicken. So now she has to improvise. She has to be creative. She has to make possibilities. And something like that was in my mind when I went to the store over the weekend and saw the empty shelves and sensed something different. So if there's no beef, but there's canned beef, why don't you sort of improvise, find the possibility, get the canned beef, take it home, invent a new dish or something like that. My worry, Alan, getting back to sort of the moral, emotional, psychological dimension, is that too many of us may be sort of paralyzed now by this unexpected hardship, and we're losing our inner instincts to improvise. But cooking is all about improvisation, right?
Let me, I agree, and let me add to that because I don't want to lose this thread that Johanna is bringing together for us on the safety nets. And I am an agricultural economist. I've spent a lot of time thinking about public policies around this, so maybe I can add to it and then have some folks come in. The notion of the safety net, I think what we're seeing come out of the White House is sort of the immediate response to get the cash in hand, and they're talking about stratifications of income. So that's the first thing. But there are many different ways to deliver safety nets, and I think this is where the possibility comes in. And I know that there are folks thinking about this in the task force, but at the community level, I think what needs to happen is we need to assess what are the greatest needs in our community, because there's a community safety net where do we need to deploy a common set of resources to get out to some of these places and spaces where people aren't even going to the grocery store, right, Johanna? So there's the community level safety net. But in addition, these checks that will be going out, each family will decide how they're going to use this for their own family. But there's also a way to provide safety nets through subsidization and approaches for the retailers. And this is something that I think there's an opportunity to be talking about, where there could be subsidization schemes on some of the items that people are buying out, like the dairy and the et cetera. And then we figure out how we augment the retailers and others as well. And so I think their natural instinct right now is to get the cash out to also stop the hoarding that's going on, providing people, Mnuchin said yesterday, we'll get these $1,000 checks out within 2 weeks. So that's providing people maybe with more comfort that they're coming. Now, I don't know if people have that comfort, but that's what I think they're trying to do.
One of the things I wanted to interject into this also is, Johanna, just to get your feedback in association with this, and that is that I haven't seen any types of communication about how we should manage ourselves as communities in relationship to how we're shopping.
Well,
And
reading my mind.
and about the stability of our food systems.
Yeah.
Well, you were reading my mind. I mean, in my neighborhood, I get lots of emails on our neighborhood listserv. If you need people are volunteering to go out for food for elderly people. So there is this community spirit, but it's very disorganized. And I think as we go through this, and if the weeks linger on, we are going to need to have some form of organization. I just got an email early this morning from a colleague in Spain, and she said that the situation is so bad there that police are actually stopping people on the street if they don't have a legitimate reason to be out there. So we are going to need organization if we have caravans of people who go to a market and are actually buying supplies for their neighbors or people who are ill and cannot get out. And I don't see anything being started like that. I told my son, who lives in a building with older Americans, I said, you ought to start a list for every floor with the co-op association and find out who is locked in and who needs help. So at least in your building, you can be the captain of that and help people who need a pharmacy or need food. But as I say, it's very ad hoc, and that's part of the problem.
Mike, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Mike,
No.
I was just going to, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go speak.
Mike, I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the systemic implications of this, of a system needed to address this sort of thing, what your perspective is.
Well, my perspective is largely, this is, as we talked about previously, it's largely about access. It's not a matter of the supply. The supply is there, I think, to Johanna's point. It's, again, almost like aid in any country, it's the distribution system. And I think, as Johanna also correctly pointed out, right now it's ad hoc. And without some way of developing or innovating, part of what we're all about is coming up with ways or suggesting ways that people could improve the possibilities around this. And I think, to the point that other people were making, the structure that's needed behind it, it has to come from two directions. One is that the actual local self-organizing piece, which is what systems do. And then the other one is from the top down. And getting those two to connect is going to be, I think, our biggest challenge. How do we get the local activities connected with a larger infrastructure and then develop access for everyone?
Steve, I want to return now just to that question about moral implications in association with how do we coach society effectively to consider not just themselves, because there's a tremendous inward turn. It seems like we need to make an outward turn towards recognizing that we need to coordinate as communities. I'm wondering if you could speak towards that.
Well, the simple, straightforward answer is leadership. But leadership depends on somebody feeling that he or she is a leader, that they can do something, that they have a call, and that in turn puts you into a larger realm of our culture, of our expectations. One of the things that I've been sensitive to and picking up from a number of colleagues in our co-roundtable network is the implication in America of our narcissism in recent decades. And Johanna, sort of going to your point about your friend and your comment to your son, right? You basically said, you can do it. And in the line we're talking about, there's not just a possibility, there's an actual probability that if you reach up, if you take a stand, if you commit yourself, your time, your effort, somebody may, be annoyed that you're knocking on the door, but that doesn't bother you. You go forward. At the cultural level, it seems to me, we have to try to reassure people that leadership is appreciated. It's needed and it's appreciated. And then to sort of close on this point, Alan, Michael, I think, put it very well. Traditionally, all our thinking and all across different cultures and religions is top down versus bottom up. And, some people in China today, it's all top down. There is no bottom up. Other points of view, going back, SDS 1962 Court Huron statement, everything is bottom up. We don't need leaders. The people can do it. People with a capital P can do it.
Sure.
My sense is sometimes there is no such thing as the people with a capital P. It's just us. And so we need to have, and this has been in past, I think key to the American success and the American culture is that, let's go back to the bromides of the Minutemen in Lexington and Concord and their wives, Molly Pitcher in New Jersey, they just stood up and they did things.
So we need to pull together, and each of us needs to stand up and play a role. Devry, I'm wondering about if you could talk about.
Johanna has such a background in this in terms of what we can do. I mean, Johanna, you're an expert in conflict, and we're starting to see that play out in social media. Can you talk a bit about what we can do at the community level?
Devry, before she gets to that, I just wanted to ask you a quick question about access. There's been an issue with regard to access to food amongst the certain populations. Now it's become more difficult. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, and then we can return to Johanna, where she can wrap up and give us some of her guidance in association with it.
I'm going to yield to Johanna because she can answer all of it.
Okay, that's fine.
Well, thank you, Devry. That's very kind. I know you can too. But there are two things. This is a podcast about opportunity as well as crisis. And I'd like to say that one opportunity may be in terms of access. We've always had this terrible problem of food waste, not only in the United States, but around the world. So in the developed world, I think there's an opportunity for communities to begin to address that in terms of access of what's left over. And as I think the other gentleman mentioned, we're not settling for the thing you're dying for on the shelf, but taking something else and being creative. So there is an opportunity to discuss food waste, not only in the context of the coronavirus crisis, but also of how we reduce that, because it's also a climate change issue, and we could educate a lot of people. I think the other thing that is perhaps maybe an opportunity, but also something we have to look at, is the way we address inequality. This morning, I just got a note from a journalist here in Washington who was covering Jose Andres's restaurant kitchens. Now, he's opened his kitchens and he's doing reduced price meals, but this is not serving the underserved communities. It's giving people a little bit of reduction in price, but I'm not going to stand on line downtown for a $6 plate from Jose Andres. So we need to have other mechanisms in addition to reduced price feeding centers that will be able to help even further reduce the inequality, because food deserts are the question we keep on addressing as people in urban areas, and we don't do anything about it. And now the reality has hit us. So I'd be interested to hear other people's comments, because we can address the food deserts and food waste within this crisis and yet help millions of people, and it's going to be millions of people who are going to need access to food.
Devry, maybe you could speak to the policy aspects of what should be communicated by leadership right now in this regard to help calm the general public and to help us to coordinate better.
Well, I mean, one thing to note before we communicate the leadership message, just for our viewers, is Johanna is talking about something that when we work on this on a daily basis, one thing that we need to remember is that 25,000 people a day worldwide die because they don't have access to food, proper nutrition. And here in the United States, the access issue existed even before this pandemic has hit. And so Johanna's point around food deserts is that we need to go to those areas immediately where we already know that access is an issue. There are a lot of civic-minded groups that are working and that are rallying and that come together. That's the first thing. And then more broadly, from a public policy leadership message, the government, I think, at the highest level has the responsibility to start framing the narrative, not just start framing the narrative, get the narrative out there about what the food supply being robust, how the supply chains are working, how are the food manufacturers staying in business. There's a lot of question around the safety of food if there are people that are ill. That hasn't really come out in a consolidated way, so that's making its way down to the state levels and then the local levels. And then from a leadership message standpoint, at the local levels, those issues that we're facing in terms of access and affordability need to make their way back up so that the leadership messaging is relevant to what's happening at the local level. So it's going to take a massively coordinated response. And right now, that's where the possibility comes in. Is there a new way to get more real-time communication out to the communities on the real situation? And in addition, where at the community level, individuals who have the capability can rally to participate and support.
Joanna, I was just going to say we have a minute left. I'm wondering if you could just give us some final thoughts.
Well, I think there are so many priorities that have been set out here in addition to leadership, but I do think that we do have in the short run a strong moral obligation to our community members at the very least, since we don't have this overarching set of orders, to take care of those who need things, to identify places and connect to our local governments where we see gaps. And remember that a lot of this country also has a shortfall of connectivity. If you're living in some rural areas of Nebraska, you don't have good bandwidth, despite what we say. So I think this will open up eyes, but we also have to be vigilant of our own neighbors. This is not about ourselves. It's really about preventing what happened in 1918. And I read these articles about that with caution. There was an incredibly good article I recommend to people that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about the pandemic of 1918 and what it did. And I strongly urge other people to start looking at this kind of literature and get some common sense about how we take care of each other. That's what I think America is about.
All right. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you,
Thank
Joanna.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you all.
Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.